There is a moment in the summer of 1940 when the entire course of human history balances on the edge of a single word. One man's decision, made in the span of a morning, against the urgent counsel of his generals, driven by something between strategic miscalculation and supreme arrogance, would save hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers from annihilation, hand Britain a miracle it had no right to expect, and ultimately guarantee that the war Adolf Hitler believed he had already won would drag on for 5 more years until it consumed him entirely. If he had simply said yes, if he had simply let his panzer divisions roll forward for another 48 hours, the history of the world would be unrecognizable to us today. This is the story of the halt order at Dunkirk, and it may be the most consequential mistake ever made in the history of warfare. To understand what happened in those critical days of late May 1940, you have to understand the intoxication of speed. The German Wehrmacht had launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries on May 10, 1940. And what followed was not merely a military campaign, it was a revolution in warfare. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had torn through the Allied defensive lines with a ferocity and momentum that left French and British commanders standing in stunned disbelief at their maps, unable to process the speed at which their positions were collapsing. In a matter of weeks, what France had assumed would be a defensive war of attrition, a slow, grinding conflict like the one their fathers had fought from 1914 to 1918, had become a catastrophic rout. The Maginot Line, that vast, enormously expensive fortified barrier that France had spent the entire interwar period constructing and believing in, had been rendered completely irrelevant because the Germans had simply gone around it. The architect of this maneuver was General Erich von Manstein, whose audacious plan to push the main armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, a region the French had confidently dismissed as impassable for tanks, had worked beyond anyone's expectations. The panzer divisions had crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, punched through the French lines, and then done something extraordinary. Instead of wheeling toward Paris, as conventional military logic might have suggested, they had turned northwest, racing toward the English Channel coast. Their objective was not the French capital, it was the sea. They were attempting to cut off and encircle the entire Allied Northern Army group, nearly 1 million men, before those soldiers could retreat or regroup. And they were succeeding. By May 20th, German armor had reached the coast near Abbeville. The encirclement was nearly complete. The British Expeditionary Force, the bulk of Britain's professional army, along with significant French and Belgian forces, was being compressed into a shrinking pocket in northern France and Belgium, with their backs increasingly toward the sea and one small port town that history was about to make famous: Dunkirk. Inside the Führer's headquarters, there was an atmosphere of almost delirious triumph. Hitler had been skeptical of the Manstein plan at first, but now he was claiming credit for it with the enthusiasm of a man who has convinced himself he was always a believer. The news coming in from the front was staggering. German units were reporting the capture of tens of thousands of prisoners. French divisions were surrendering wholesale. The British were falling back toward the coast in disarray. This was not merely victory. This was the kind of annihilating, total, world historical triumph that Hitler had always believed was Germany's destiny. The France that had humiliated Germany at Versailles in 1919, that had occupied German territory and stripped Germany of its dignity, was on the verge of total collapse. And the British, those island people whom Hitler had alternately admired and despised, those architects of the global empire he both envied and resented, were about to lose their entire army. And then, on May 24, 1940, Hitler issued the order that still confounds historians. He stopped the tanks. The instruction that went out from Führer headquarters to the armored units racing toward Dunkirk was unambiguous. The panzer divisions were to halt. They were to hold their current positions. They were not to advance. The German armor, which had traveled hundreds of miles in 2 weeks, which had broken everything placed in front of it, which was within striking distance of the trapped Allied forces, was ordered to stand still. The commanders on the ground were incredulous. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant, aggressive panzer commander whose tanks were closest to the coast, could not believe what he was reading. His forces had momentum, fuel, and fighting strength. The enemy was retreating, demoralized, short of equipment and supplies. This was the moment to close the trap. This was the moment to destroy the British Army completely, and he was being told to stop. He would later describe his reaction in terms that barely concealed his fury. General Ewald von Kleist, commanding the armored group, argued against the order directly. Other senior officers lodged protests through channels. None of it mattered. The order stood. The question that has occupied historians ever since is simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to answer. Why? The most commonly cited reason at the time, and one that Hitler himself emphasized in his explanations, was the condition of the panzer divisions. After 2 weeks of continuous high-speed advance over difficult terrain, the tanks needed maintenance. Breakdowns had accumulated. Supply lines were stretched thin. The armor had been operating at a tempo that peacetime training had never fully anticipated, and the mechanical strain was real. Hitler's concern, which was shared by some senior officers, was that if the armored spearheads pushed forward without pause, they might exhaust themselves at the precise moment when French reserves launched a counterattack. A counterattack that German intelligence suggested might be coming from the south. To use up the panzers completing the destruction of an already trapped enemy, only to find them unable to meet a fresh threat, would be strategically reckless. The halt would give the armor time to consolidate, refit, and prepare for the next phase of the campaign. The drive south toward Paris, and the decisive defeat of the remaining French forces. There is logic in this argument. It is not the logic of a madman or a fool. The German campaign in France could not end at Dunkirk. There was still the better part of the French army to deal with. There were still political and diplomatic complications to manage. And there was, in the thinking of the German High Command, a genuine uncertainty about Allied intentions. The speed of the German advance had been almost as surprising to the Germans as it had been to the Allies. And the fear of overextension, of advancing too far, too fast, beyond the ability to sustain, was not irrational. But there is another layer to the halt order that goes beyond the tactical. It concerns Hermann Göring. Göring was the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and he was also one of the most senior figures in the Nazi state, second only to Hitler himself in formal rank, and perhaps closer than anyone to Hitler in personal intimacy. He was vain, theatrical, corrupt, and politically astute enough to recognize an opportunity when he saw one. When he learned that the British and French were being compressed into the Dunkirk pocket, he went to Hitler with a proposal. Let the Luftwaffe finish the job. Let the Air Force, his Air Force, be the instrument of the final destruction. The panzers could stand back, preserve themselves for the battles ahead, and Göring's bombers would annihilate the trapped Allied forces from above. It would be a triumph not just for Germany, but specifically for the Luftwaffe, and specifically for Göring. Hitler, who had deep confidence in the Luftwaffe and in Göring personally, and who may also have been influenced by a desire to protect the panzer forces for the subsequent campaign, was receptive. The halt order was issued. The skies over Dunkirk were designated as the Luftwaffe's domain. What Göring had not fully reckoned with, and what would become catastrophically apparent in the days that followed, was the weather, the geography, and the Royal Air Force. The beaches and harbor of Dunkirk were not ideal terrain for the kind of precision bombardment that Göring had promised. The ground was marshy and soft, which meant that many bombs detonated harmlessly in the sand rather than creating the lethal shrapnel fields that made bombing effective on firmer terrain. Cloud cover and coastal haze repeatedly grounded German aircraft or degraded the accuracy of their attacks. And over the beaches and the waters of the Channel, RAF Fighter Command showed up in force. The Battle of Britain had not yet begun. That campaign would come later, in the summer skies over England. But the fierce preliminary struggle being fought over Dunkirk was a preview of what the Luftwaffe would encounter when it turned its attention northward. RAF pilots flying from bases in England that were close enough to allow meaningful combat time over the battle zone contested German air superiority with a ferocity that surprised Göring's commanders. The Luftwaffe did real damage. Ships were sunk. Men were killed on the beaches. But the complete annihilation that Göring had promised did not materialize. On the ground, the halt gave the Allied forces something they had no right to expect: time. And the British used that time with a desperation and an organizational genius that, looking back, still seems almost miraculous. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, operating from a tunnel beneath Dover Castle, one of the oldest fortifications in England, carved into the chalk cliffs above the Channel, began to orchestrate what would become known as Operation Dynamo. The evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force and as many Allied troops as could be saved from the beaches and harbor of Dunkirk. He had a fleet of Royal Navy destroyers and support vessels. He had a timetable measured not in weeks, but in days. And he had, remarkably, an idea that came to seem increasingly inspired as the operation unfolded. He would call on the small boats. The appeal went out across the southeastern coast of England. Every vessel that could cross the Channel, fishing boats, pleasure cruisers, ferries, lifeboats, Thames River launches, private yachts, was to be requisitioned or volunteered for the crossing. The owners of these vessels, many of them civilian sailors with no military training and no combat experience, were asked to sail into a war zone under Luftwaffe attack to take men off beaches under fire and carry them home. And they came. Hundreds of them. The stories of the small boats of Dunkirk have become part of the mythology of British national identity. And like all powerful myths, they contain a great deal of truth. Those civilian vessels did cross the Channel. They did go to the beaches. They did take men aboard, sometimes in the hundreds, overloaded far beyond any sensible capacity. And they did bring them home. Not all of them made it back. Some were sunk by bombing. Some were lost to accidents and collision in the crowded, chaotic waters. But enough of them made the crossing to matter enormously. Between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, the Royal Navy and the flotilla of small and large vessels that Operation Dynamo mobilized evacuated 338 to 226 men from the beaches and harbor of Dunkirk. The number is staggering. When Ramsay had first assessed the situation and set his planners to work, an optimistic estimate had suggested they might save 45,000 men before German pressure made further evacuation impossible. What they actually achieved was more than 7 times that optimistic figure. The Panzer halt had lasted roughly 3 days before Hitler finally rescinded it on May 26th. By that point, the Allied perimeter had been strengthened, defensive lines had been organized, and the evacuation was already beginning. German armor was moving again now, and the fighting around the Dunkirk perimeter in those days was savage and costly. French units in particular fought with extraordinary courage to hold the defensive lines that made the evacuation possible, and many of them paid for that sacrifice with their lives or their freedom. But the window, however narrow, however contested, was open, and through that window poured the men who would become the core of the army that Britain would spend the next 4 years rebuilding, rearming, and ultimately sending back to liberate the continent. When Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons on June 4, 1940, and delivered what would become one of the most celebrated speeches in the English language, he was careful to warn against treating Dunkirk as a victory. Wars, he observed, are not won by evacuations. He acknowledged the losses, the equipment left behind on the beaches, the ships sunk in the channel, the men killed or captured in the fighting. He was right to strike this note. By any purely military measure, the fall of France was a catastrophic defeat for the Allies. The British Expeditionary Force had lost virtually all of its heavy equipment. The French army had been shattered. A continent had fallen under Nazi occupation. These were not small things, and yet, the men who came back from Dunkirk were alive. They were demoralized, exhausted, some of them barely coherent from the ordeal, but they were alive, and they were soldiers, and they could be soldiers again. Over the following months, Churchill and his government would work to re-equip and retrain them. The Americans, still technically neutral but increasingly committed to British survival, would begin sending supplies across the Atlantic. The RAF would fight and win the Battle of Britain that summer, denying Hitler the air superiority he needed for an invasion of the British Isles. And Britain would survive. Battered, stretched to its financial and psychological limits, but intact, defiant, and still fighting. Now consider what does not happen if Dunkirk fails completely. If the German armor is not halted on May 24th. If the panzer divisions roll forward and close the trap before the evacuation can begin. If 300,000 British and Allied soldiers are killed or captured on those beaches. There is no British army to rebuild. There may be no British government willing to fight on. Churchill himself, who had become Prime Minister only 2 weeks earlier, was already engaged in fierce private arguments with members of his own war cabinet about whether to seek a negotiated peace with Hitler. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was actively exploring the possibility through Italian intermediaries. Churchill was winning that argument, but he was winning it, in part, because the soldiers were coming home. Because the British people, listening to the radio broadcasts, reading the newspapers, watching the men stream off the trains at stations across England, could see that their army was not destroyed. The evacuation was not a victory, but it was not an extinction either. It was survival. And survival was enough to keep the fight going. Without Dunkirk, Halifax's argument becomes overwhelming. Without an army, without any realistic prospect of defending the British Isles against invasion, without the morale boost of knowing that their men had come home, it is very hard to imagine a British political establishment choosing to fight on. And if Britain makes peace in June 1940, the entire strategic landscape of the war changes beyond recognition. America does not enter the war through the back door of the Atlantic Alliance with Britain, because there is no Britain to ally with. The enormous industrial and military capacity of the United States, which will ultimately be the decisive factor in the Allied victory, has no European theater through which to engage. Lend-Lease, the lifeline that keeps Britain fighting through 1941, does not exist, or exists in a form too small and too late to matter. The strategic bombing campaign that will eventually gut German industrial capacity begins later, is less sustained, and may never reach the intensity that helps break German resistance. The North African campaigns, which provide the Allies with vital experience and the eventual jumping-off point for the invasion of Sicily and Italy, do not occur in the same way or at the same time. Most consequentially of all, there is no D-Day. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, is launched from Britain. If Britain is not a fighting power, if it has been neutralized through peace or conquest, there is no island fortress from which to launch the largest amphibious operation in history. Western Europe remains under German control. In the east, meanwhile, Hitler still invades the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa happens regardless of what occurs at Dunkirk, because the destruction of Soviet Bolshevism and the conquest of Lebensraum in the East is the central ideological obsession of National Socialism. The thing Hitler has been planning since he wrote Mein Kampf in his prison cell in 1924. But without a two-front war, without the constant drain of forces to the West, without the strategic pressure of British resistance and American involvement, the Wehrmacht's campaign in the East unfolds with fewer constraints. The German army that invades the Soviet Union in a world where Britain has made peace is larger, better supplied, and fighting on only one front. The Soviets still resist, and resist ferociously. The suffering and sacrifice of the Soviet people in what they call the Great Patriotic War remains almost incomprehensible in scale. But the German military machine they are facing is heavier and less distracted. The outcome is genuinely uncertain in ways that it was not in the actual history of the war. Hitler's halt order, in other words, was not merely a tactical mistake. It was a strategic catastrophe of the first magnitude. It gave the British Army its life. It gave Britain its defiance. It gave the Allied coalition the time and the base it needed to grow strong enough to return to Europe and destroy everything Hitler had built. 3 days of halted panzers. 3 days of Göring's bombers failing to do what the tanks could have done. 3 days of small boats crossing the channel and bringing men home. The entire trajectory of the war, and with it, the entire shape of the post-war world, runs through those 3 days at the edge of the sea in a battered French port town in the late spring of 1940. Why did Hitler stop the tanks? The debate continues. The mechanical condition of the panzers. Göring's ambition. Hitler's own uncertainty about how Britain would respond to a truly crushing defeat. There is a theory, disputed but persistent, that Hitler harbored a hope of a negotiated peace with Britain and did not want to humiliate the British Army to the point where such a peace became politically impossible in London. Some historians have pointed to Hitler's own infantry background, his experience of the Western Front in the First World War, and a consequent distrust of armored warfare that his generals did not share. Others have emphasized the simple institutional dynamics of a command structure in which a dictator's caution, however misplaced, could not be effectively countered by the professional officers who saw the opportunity he was throwing away. All of these factors were probably real. All of them probably played some role. Wars, like all great human events, are not the products of single causes, but of chains of contingency that lock together in ways that sometimes feel inevitable in retrospect, and were anything but inevitable in the moment. What is clear is the result. The tanks stopped, the boats came, the men went home, and the world that emerged from the war, the world we still, in many essential ways, inhabit, was shaped by those 3 days on the beaches of Dunkirk, more than by almost any other single event of the entire conflict. There is something almost unbearable about the contingency of it, about the smallness of the margin. The soldiers on the beaches did not know, in those first terrible days of waiting, whether any of them were going to get out. They stood in lines that stretched into the sea, waiting for boats that might not come, under a sky contested by aircraft fighting and dying above them, knowing that German armor was somewhere to the south and east, and might break through the defensive perimeter at any hour. The officers trying to maintain order on those beaches, trying to stop the chaos from becoming a complete collapse, had no certainty that the evacuation would succeed. Ramsay, in his tunnel under Dover Castle, was working with estimates and guesses, and the desperate hope that the variables would break favorably. Churchill, in London, was fighting a political battle inside his own government, while also trying to project a confidence he may not have entirely felt. And the decision that made all of it possible had been made not by any of them, but by their enemy. Hitler's order, issued in the morning of May 24, 1940, was the gift that the Allied cause could never have given itself. It was the error that the British Army could never have manufactured. It was the reprieve that arrived not because of superior strategy or fighting quality or industrial strength. Those things would come later. But because a man who was certain of his own genius had, in this one critical instance, made a mistake that his own generals recognized immediately, and that history has been analyzing, debating, and marveling at ever since. The small boats came home. 338,000 men stepped back onto British soil, and the war that Hitler thought he had already won continued for 5 more years, until the armies born from Dunkirk, multiplied and reinforced by the power of an awakened alliance, came back across the Channel and the Mediterranean, and finally closed the ring around everything the Third Reich had built, and brought it to rubble and silence and reckoning. The decision was made in a morning. The consequences lasted a century, and they are still lasting now. History turns on moments smaller than we imagine, on orders given and rescinded, on men standing at maps, making choices that feel, in the moment, like the exercise of clear military judgment, and that reveal themselves, over time, to be something far larger. Something that changes everything. Think about the ordinary men who stood in those queues on the sand. The privates and corporals and sergeants who had been drafted or had volunteered, who had crossed the Channel in the autumn of 1939, full of resolve and uncertainty, who had been swept up in a collapse so swift and total that many of them barely understood what had happened to them. Men who had thrown away their rifles on the orders of their officers so as not to slow the march to the coast. Men who had walked for days, sleeping in ditches, eating what they could find, watching the columns of smoke rising from burning towns to the south and east, and knowing, in the wordless way soldiers know these things, that the tactical situation was extremely bad. Men who had watched their officers argue on the beaches, watched the Navy struggle to get close enough to the shallow water to take men aboard, watched friends wade out to their chests and their shoulders and their chins, trying to reach boats that were always a little too far away. Those men did not know about the halt order. They did not know that Hitler had given them 3 days. They did not know that Göring's promise had been inflated beyond what the Luftwaffe could deliver. They knew only what was in front of them. The sea, the boats, the sound of the bombs, the feel of the sand under their boots. Some of them waited for days, sleeping where they stood in the queue, before they finally got off. Some of them did not get off at all. The French soldiers who held the perimeter to the very end, who fought on after the British ships had stopped coming, who were left behind as prisoners and in many cases as dead men. Those soldiers saved the evacuation by sacrificing their own freedom, and the debt that history owes them is rarely paid in full. But enough of them got off. That is the brutal arithmetic of the thing. Enough of them got off to matter, to tip the scales of the war, to deny Hitler the complete destruction he had been within touching distance of achieving. And there is something else worth understanding about what those returning men meant to the people who watched them come home. Britain in the spring of 1940 was a country that had been at war for 8 months, but had not yet fully felt the weight of it. The phony war, that strange, suspended period between September 1939 and May 1940, when the formal state of war existed but the killing had not yet come to Britain itself, had produced a kind of unreality in the public mind. People had sent their children to the countryside as evacuees. They had carried their gas masks. They had observed the blackout. And they had listened to news from France with growing anxiety. But the war had not yet arrived as a physical, visceral, immediate fact. Dunkirk arrived. The men coming off the trains at Ramsgate and Folkestone and Dover and London, dirty and hollow-eyed and grateful and broken. were the war made flesh, and their survival, against what everyone could see had been terrible odds, produced in the British public not the despair that military defeat might have been expected to generate, but something stranger and more powerful. It produced a kind of furious resolve, a sense that if those men could endure what they had endured and still come home, then Britain itself could endure whatever was coming next. Churchill's speeches in those days did not create that resolve from nothing. He articulated and amplified something that was already there, something that the returning men had carried home with them without fully intending to. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Those words landed on a country that had just watched its army come home from beaches, and the country heard them differently because of it. This is the compounding effect of the halt order. It did not merely preserve an army. It preserved a national will. And national will, in the kind of total war that the 20th century invented, is not a soft and sentimental thing. It is a strategic resource as real and as decisive as steel tonnage or aircraft production numbers. A country that has decided it will not give up will not give up. And no country demonstrated that more clearly over the next 4 years than Britain, which endured the Blitz, the U-boat campaign, the fall of Singapore, the disasters of the early desert campaigns, the grinding uncertainty of a war whose outcome was never guaranteed, and kept fighting, kept producing, kept making the political and military decisions that eventually brought the Allies to Normandy in June 1944. None of that was certain in May 1940. All of it became possible because of what happened, or rather, what did not happen, on the road to Dunkirk. Because a man said, "Stop," when every military instinct around him was screaming, "Go." The halt order at Dunkirk is one of those historical events that becomes more remarkable the more closely you examine it, not less. It does not simplify into a clean lesson or a tidy moral. It is not a story about good strategy defeating bad strategy, because the German strategy in France in 1940 was brilliantly executed right up to the moment it wasn't. It is not a story about courage triumphing over cowardice, because the courage was real on both sides of the wire at Dunkirk. It is a story about the strange, fragile, decisive nature of decision-making under pressure, about how the choices made at the top of military and political command structures cascade downward in ways that alter the fate of hundreds of thousands of people who never know that those choices were made. The soldiers on the beach did not know about the halt order. The sailors in the small boats did not know. The women waiting at the docks did not know. But they lived inside its consequences. They were alive because of it. The decision was made in a morning. The consequences lasted a century, and they are still lasting now. History turns on moments smaller than we imagine, on orders given and rescinded, on men standing at maps, making choices that feel, in the moment, like the exercise of clear military judgment, and that reveal themselves, over time, to be something far larger. Something that changes everything. If this story made you stop and think, if you want to go deeper into the moments and the men and women and decisions that shape the world we live in, there are more of them waiting for you here. The history is full of hinges, full of days when everything could have gone differently. Subscribe, and let's keep finding them together.